I'm Tim Henriques with the Fantasy Book Ranking System, and in today's review, we're going to check out The Last Wish, by Andrzej Sapkowski, and basically this is the first book that introduces the character of the Witcher, which you may have heard about or seen from some famous video games. Right, so The Last Wish. If you're not familiar with this review, basically the idea here is to help you, the reader, decide if this is how you want to spend your time reading this book. A lot of times when you read reviews on Amazon, most things get 3.5 to 4.5 stars. It's hard to separate what's better or not. And even after reading a bunch of reviews, you just wonder, well, do you like the same thing that the reviewer liked? And so what I wanted to do was basically compare books against some different standards, and that way you can see, oh yes, I like the same thing that he does, I'll probably like this, or no, I think I want to go in a different direction. The secondary goal behind creating this was I want to get into fantasy writing myself. I've written some nonfiction books, but I wanted to really see what makes fantasy writing tick and kind of break it down. So I did this to help myself understand how what makes great books great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on a scale on 15 different attributes, we're going to rank books on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super awesome and epic, and I'll give you an example of what a 10 is for each category. 8 is pretty solid, 6 and below is pretty crappy. Most books get at least reasonably good scores because I do pre-screen, so any book that super sucks I tend not to read in the first place. Also, some other different characteristics of the book I'll just kind of describe without ranking. Then I'll give what I thought were flaws, some strengths, my overall impression, and then at the end I'll give that book its own unique FaBR score so that then we can compare and see where it's at among the other fantasy books that are out there. So let's get started. So how epic is this story? I'd give this an overall of a 7. It's not a broad, sweeping story. It doesn't involve tons of different characters all the way throughout. So something like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Star Wars is going to get a 10. So it's lacking a little bit in that epicness. You've got one main character, goes on a series of small, like little mini quests, and that's kind of it. You never feel like the entire world's a danger, and so it's a little more self-contained. Not necessarily a bad thing, but not as broad and sweeping as some other stories. How well written is it? Here it's going to be a 7.5. Adequately well written. Now, to be fair, this book is translated from the original language, so it's certainly possible, and I did not read the original and could not. It's certainly possible that the original was just brilliantly written, but as it's translated in English, I mean, it still does a pretty good job given that it's translated. I'm tempted to give it higher marks, but if you just compare it as a standalone, there's some word choice that's a little weird and unusual. Sometimes that works, but more often it doesn't, so it's a little bit of a weak spot for this. Certainly nothing like Name of the Wind or Game of Thrones, that to me would be 10s and written super, super well. How real does it feel? This has a little more of a real feel to it, so a little more like you're kind of there. Certain things are kind of described more like you're on the character's shoulders and like you're watching it from a movie, but definitely not as real as, say, the First of All trilogy or Game of Thrones, which would get 10s for that. So this is an 8. What lessons are taught? I didn't think lessons were necessarily a huge theme of the book, more like telling interesting stories. There's often some moral consequences to what's going on, but none of them seem perfect. None of them seem crystal clear in which direction the reader or you want the character to go. So about a 7.5, something like a Star Wars would get a 10. Is the book a page turner? Not a massive page turner. It's kind of like standalone chapters, so you can just read one chapter and be like, okay, fine. The character's somewhat interesting, so you want to keep reading, but it's not. It doesn't just drag you from one place to the next. Something like the Da Vinci Code or Maltese Falcon would probably get a 10 for that. How memorable is the story? The story itself, again, a series of kind of unrelated individual little mini quests. I have a few elements that are kind of cool, but I mean, I read it 6 months ago, and I would say most of those stories are kind of fading already, so it's not that memorable to me. Star Wars would get a 10. The main character is going to be generally the best thing about this, and that's really the hook. If you love The Witcher, a little bit like a Conan style story, and then you just want to keep reading anything about him, then you'll probably enjoy it. If you don't get super hooked, then you're definitely not going to like the story as much. So The Witcher's interesting, but it's just not, to me, it just doesn't quite grab me. For example, a Conan is a 10, something that you can never forget that character. This guy's kind of cool, but it's still my first introduction to him. I wasn't just blown away. It's a pretty cool character, but there's other cool characters out there as well. So 8.5 for that. And then the secondary characters are definitely kind of lacking. There's no like massive secondary character that just always continues throughout. So it's just again a series of kind of unrelated quests, and they're not connected that well. So to me, this was a negative. So only a 6 here. Something like a Star Wars with all of its memorable secondary characters would get a 10. How much do you want to read the next book? Now, it is worth mentioning that since this book has come out, there's been other Witcher-related books out there, but it's not, I don't see it as necessarily a series per se, but more, again, just some books of kind of the same character, same realm, without just a continuing series. So this is a standalone book. You can read it by yourself, so I don't see this as a series. So that's not applicable for that. How rereadable is it? I mean, you can read it if you want, if you really like the character. It had some interesting, reasonably well-written things about it. Maybe the original would be super rereadable, but for me, I don't think it'd be worth the time to reread it, so just a 7 there. How clear is good and evil? It's not perfectly clear, and sometimes he has to kind of choose between the lesser of two evils, but often you can kind of see what the characters want him to do, and then his choice to kind of, he's supposed to kind of, follow walk this path of this moral code that he's got. And so I thought it was reasonably clear kind of what should happen, what was going on. But still occasionally some interesting choices, so not perfectly clear. I personally tend to prefer stories that are a little on the reasonably clear side or even more clear. How prevalent is the magic? I would say it's kind of like a Lord of the Rings style of magic. So there's just some magic out there. He has kind of like a magic sword and can do some magic things with stuff, but it isn't like Harry Potter where just spells are flying everywhere and every person in the world has magic. So this would be closer to the low side than the high side, but I'd still call it moderate for both the main character and the world itself. What age is appropriate? For me, I would give it a 12. I think it's a little advanced. The word or reading is just a little too much for those younger readers. But it's not a super gory Demon Cycle or a Game of Thrones where it's very vivid and there's like big sex scenes and things like that. So 12 plus seems appropriate for this. And since I'm viewing this as the standalone novel, then yes, this is finished. So it's just that one individual book right there. So for flaws, again, it's kind of a series of standalone mini adventures. Interesting, but to me that doesn't really wrap it together, so I didn't feel like it was neatly tied together. The work is translated, and even though that's done quite well, it's still not perfect, so that has some negatives. And then the plot points themselves, a few of the interesting questions he faced, but the real plot is not super memorable. What happened, in what order, none of that to me was a massive strength of the story. It does introduce a reader to a cool and a relatively famous character. So if you've heard of The Witcher, if you've played the games, and I should point out I have not played the games, so you might really then really like to see this kind of character kind of come to life in that way. That might be more important to you. But again, that character's not quite that like epic, Conan or Luke Skywalker or something where you're just like, oh, that character is just going to live on with me forever. At least for me, I didn't have enough personality for that. Character does have to make some interesting moral decisions, which I thought was a little bit of a strength. It doesn't flow well, and the secondary characters weren't that memorable, so that's a negative. And again, it might be more appealing if you've already kind of created a relationship and then you can kind of see the character doing certain things. So what would I give this book? My score for this book, for The Last Wish, would be a 77. So it's a decent book. It's got some good points to it. I don't think you would regret reading it. I certainly didn't regret reading it, but I wasn't that compelled to then seek out other books by the author or to continue to read about the story. But again, if you've already kind of developed an attachment for that character and you really want to learn more, then you certainly might be moving that score up a little bit. But it's not going to compete with those high 80s and the rare 90 books out there, in my opinion. If you want to see other book reviews, go ahead and continue to watch this YouTube channel or check out my website, timhenriques.com. If there's books you want me to review, feel free to post it in the comments. If you have questions, discussions, you think I'm an idiot about something, feel free to post that as well, and we can chat about it.